So I'm going to be with you this week and next week. And what I've decided to do is to take 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and to slow it down and to do the first part this week, second part next week. So this week, we're going to look at the underbelly, the underside of 2 Corinthians 12. Or to use a word that I don't always like using, the negative side. And that is the thorn in the flesh. And next week, I want to speak about the sufficiency of God's grace as a follow-up, because the two go side by, well, top and bottom, the same side, two sides of one coin. Now, over the years that I've been in ministry, I have found 2 Corinthians to be the most helpful book for me personally. I've always enjoyed reading it and studying it and preaching it. It's one of the most personal of Paul's letters. He speaks more about himself in 2 Corinthians than in any one of his other letters. And 2 Corinthians is primarily about his ministry. And as you read through 2 Corinthians, you will discover that Paul is going through a very difficult time. He's going through a very difficult time with the Corinthians, because the Corinthians, in a sense, have almost deserted him. They've turned their backs on him. And the reason why they have done this, secondly, is because of people who are known as the super apostles. And these were people who were going around ministering, and they had caught the eye and the attention of the Corinthians. And so when they looked at these super apostles and they looked at Paul, they preferred the super apostles because they looked more super. They looked cool. They looked like the real deal. Paul, on the other hand, was very unimpressive. He was very ordinary. He was unappealing and he was unspectacular. And so Paul is writing this letter to these Corinthians to speak about who are the true apostles. And we'll see how he deals with it when we go through the first part of chapter 12 this morning. But one of the things that we need to understand is that the real question that was coming up for the Apostle Paul was, did he have the true credentials of an apostle? Is this the way apostles look and behave? And the reason why this came up, it wasn't so much that they were questioning his credentials, they were questioning whether he had any credentials. Everything was the opposite. Everything was the opposite to what they had thought. Paul was completely opposite to the super apostles. And so Paul was a picture of weakness. He was a picture of weakness. He was a picture of one who bore in his body, more than likely, as well as in his speaking, and the whole way in which he conducted his ministry. He behaved as one who wasn't on top of things. And so this was a way that the super apostles could exploit him. So when we look at the passage this morning, the first thing I want you to notice is that Paul defends himself by boasting. Now that may be a strange heading to have for my first point, but Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 12:1. I must go on boasting. So Paul's going to go on boasting, and you say, well, when did he start boasting? Well, he started boasting in chapter 11, which is the chapter before 12, and he says this: whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool, he says. I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin and I do not inwardly burn? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. That's what Paul is boasting about. Now, can you imagine getting a CV from someone applying to Southern Cross, like I've just read to you? Would you say, there's the minister we need? Or do you want to know other things about him? Do you want to know about his personality? Do we want to know how well he preaches, how well he performs? Is he good with children? Is he good with teenagers? Has he got this? Has he got that? And Paul gives this long list of things that, quite frankly, frighten me to think that he, as an apostle, had to go through this. And he calls all these things my weaknesses. You see? And so Paul here does this. So chapter 12 is a continuation of chapter 11, and we mustn't miss that. It's a very important step. And so in chapter 11 again, verse 12, which is earlier to the part I read, he says this: I will keep on what I am doing in order to cut the ground from under those who want an opportunity to be considered equal with us in things that they boast about. You see, Paul is playing their game, but he's using different criteria. And instead of using strengths, he uses weaknesses as his credential for ministry, for being an apostle. And here he's saying, I'm doing this because I want to cut the ground from under these super apostles. I want them to come crashing down. So he's trying to beat them at their own game. Now, the second thing you'll notice in this chapter is in verse 1 again. And by the way, Paul says here quite clearly, he says, I know that this boasting, in boasting like this, there's no gain. There's no gain in boasting. He says, but I know that. Then he says this, but I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. So now he brings in something else, which is completely different to chapter 11 and the category that he gave us there. Now he starts speaking about visions and revelations. And this is more than likely the very spot, the very credential that the super apostles were boasting about. You see, they love to speak about their ecstatic experiences. They love to speak about what the Lord had said to them, what they have seen, and what they have experienced. And so Paul plays that game with them. And he says, I'm now going to go on to visions and revelations. I'm going to tell you about my revelation, my vision that the Lord gave to me. This is from the Lord, he says. And the question you've got to ask yourself, what exactly did Paul experience? Well, he tells us in verse 2, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I don't know, but God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. And now there's a bit of mystery and there are things we can't answer, but we've got to say, I mean, Paul tells us that he was caught up into the third heaven. So the Jews used to think of the first heaven as being the sort of the sky as we know it. So it's within our atmosphere. And then the second heavens would be the space that is around it. But then there's that outer darkness or the outer unknown that goes beyond our space. You see, what lies beyond space? And that would be the third heaven. And so Paul here speaks that he had a vision of heaven, and it's almost on the same level as John in the book of Revelation. You know, in John's book in Revelation, he says, I saw heaven opened. He saw a door. And he saw heaven opened. And the whole of John's vision, the whole of Revelation is looking into what's going on in that third heaven where God dwells. And Paul says, that's what I've had. I was caught up. And he says it twice. I was caught up. And he says, I don't quite know how it happened. I don't know whether I was in my body or if I was out of my body. And visions were often like this, and experiences people didn't know. Like Ezekiel, in his vision, he's picked up by the hair and he's carried from exile back to Jerusalem to go and look at the way things are going. Now, was he actually picked up and carried there? Or was he given a vision, an inward experience? Or did something appear before him that he could see? Well, it doesn't matter. Paul says it doesn't matter whether I was in the body, because he says twice, he says, God knows whether it was in the body or out of the body. He calls on God to be his witness. So Paul here has had an incredible experience of heaven. And he tells us that he saw things that he was not, that are inexpressible, things that no one is permitted to tell. Paul is forbidden to speak about it. He cannot speak about it. It's one of those visions. It's one of those revelations. You see, what Paul really saw there was the ultimate goal of the Christian life. He saw paradise. He saw where the Christian life was going. Wouldn't you like to have a vision of the end of your life as a Christian and to see something of paradise? Well, that's what Paul saw. Then the third thing I want you to notice about this passage is that Paul goes on to say that he will refrain. And he says this himself. He describes it almost in the third person by saying he saw things that no man is permitted to tell. But then he goes on in verse 5 and he says, I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except my weaknesses. And we're going to come back to that. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, but I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. So Paul here says he's not refraining from speaking about it because it's untrue. Like, I'm not too sure of myself. I'm going to be really embarrassed if I tell people that I've been up into the third heaven. He doesn't say that. He says, if I start talking to you, I'm going to look like a fool to you. But I will be speaking the truth. So he's not apologizing for what he has experienced. So you see, what Paul is doing here is Paul is putting himself on the same level, if not a higher level, than the super apostles. But he refrains from speaking about it. It's always very difficult when you have experienced something, or even if you have an ability and you have a gift and God has endowed you with special ability. The temptation is always to speak about it. It's always, and of course, Facebook and Instagram. I must tell you, if I can take an aside here, I'm amazed at what people put on Facebook, and I'm not on either of them. For that reason, I can't handle it. The way people speak about themselves and their achievements and all sorts of things about themselves. As Christians, this ought not to be. We ought not to be advertising ourselves and even our experiences, and may I add, even our achievements. We must refrain. And I'll tell you the reason why. Same reason why Paul gives it, so that no one will think more of you than is warranted. So that no one will think more of you than is warranted. When I was looking at this passage, it reminded me of that incident in Acts chapter 24 when Paul and Barnabas went to Lystra, and Paul healed a man who was lame. And when the crowd saw, chapter 14, verse 11, what Paul had done, they shouted, in their own language, the gods have come down to us in human form. I find that quite amusing, because there are times when people present themselves, the gods are amongst you. Here I am. And Paul says, no, please stop this. Don't do this. There's no place for it in the Christian life. And you know, this sort of thing affects us all. We all want to be well thought of. And the more the better, because that makes us feel good, gives us some significance. But you know, Paul here purposely kept quiet. Not because the words were, or the experience that he had was so mysterious and so inexplicable, but because he didn't want people to think more highly of him than he ought. And that's why he doesn't refer to it. You know, I remember Broughton Knox, who was an incredibly humble man, who was the founder of George Whitfield College. I remember him saying once, you should try and get as many degrees as possible, but don't ever speak about them. Let other people worry about them, but not you. I've never forgotten that, because he was a living example. He was a brilliant man. He's more than likely one of the only men that I've known who was an independent thinker. Nothing that he said could you trace back to a book, because it came from. He was an original thinker. He was a true intellectual. But he was more than a servant. He was a slave. And he never spoke about his achievements, never. And yet we all knew, we could see. Let other people worry about it. And then the fourth thing I want you to notice about this passage is that the Lord gives Paul a thorn in the flesh. He said, but I refrain, so no one will think more highly of me than is warranted, or because of these surpassing great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. You see, it is interesting that, sorry, I just want to get another translation, and this is typically me when I write my notes out, and then the reason why I'm doing this is because there's a manuscript discrepancy at this point. Because it actually, and you'll see it in the ESV, which is more correct, he says, it starts with this. In order that I do not become conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh. And it ends with the same thing, that I was given this thorn so that I did not become conceited. So the beginning and the end of that phrase is bookended by, in order that I do not become conceited. Now, there's three questions quickly that I want to ask about this thorn. The first question that everybody spends too much time on is, what was the thorn? And to give you the simple answer, we don't know. So you can dig as much as you like, and you can speculate, and so can I. And we can have an evening together, perhaps, and we can share all our ideas, and then we'll go away and say, well, we're not sure of any of them, because that is the case. But a thorn was a sharp object that caused irritation. I hate thorns, and I hate it especially if I can't find it. It's so small, you know. So Jenny and I normally have sort of telescopes and binoculars and glasses and looking for this thing, and I'll end up almost digging a hole in my finger or in my arm or somewhere. But, you know, a thorn is a sharp, irritating, which is why Paul says here, it was given to torment me. It's given to torment me. The word for thorn is the word scallops, and it could actually refer to being impaled on a stake. So it could be anything from a small, irritating thorn that sort of gets into your body, and Paul never got rid of it, because he still has it 14 years later. He tells us that 14 years ago, he was caught up into and this happened. And when he came, with the experience of the revelation, he got the thorn. God sometimes works like that. When we have an experience that takes us into the very heavens, God has to bring us down because we are so prone to pride and conceit. You see? And Paul had been living with this more than likely for about 14 years. And it is still a reality in his life. But was it physical? Because it says it's a thorn in the flesh. Flesh, that's my body. Or was it spiritual? It's also called a messenger of Satan. Was it a sort of a demonic thing? Was it, that he was oppressed by demons and sort of getting at him? Was it psychological? I mean, some people, I don't know where they get it from, but some commentators have come up with psychological problems. Paul had an inner emotional struggle, which is kind of linked to the messenger of Satan. So, or is it metaphorical? Is it like saying, it's like a pain in the neck? Now, when we talk like that, it's metaphorical. We don't actually have a literal pain in the neck. But we're trying to talk metaphorically and use a picture to describe what we are going through. So it's very unclear, and it could be virtually anything. In actual fact, if you go back to chapter 11, any of those things that I read could have been the thorn in the flesh. Anything that debilitates you, anything that hinders you in your performance, in your own strength, in you doing it, anything that hinders you, you say, I just wish I didn't have this. So Paul, he had this experience of going into there, but he comes out and he's given a thorn. It's like Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God and he came away with a limp, which is why I limp. They say you shouldn't ever trust a leader who doesn't limp. And I would add to that, who doesn't also have a walking stick. That's just a joke. So thorns come in different shapes and sizes. And they literally could be anything. God could send anything. And you may be thinking of something right now. You may be going through something right now that if only this thing was out of the way, I would be able to function so much better because I know I have the ability. I am so good. Lord, so we always pray, Lord, please remove all the obstacles. Make my pathway clear. Take out all the rocks and all the pitfalls and all the dangers, Lord. No. With Paul, he does the exact opposite. He gives him a thorn so that he would rely more upon God's grace and not on himself. He gives him something which forces him to almost be discouraged about himself and to say, I can't do this in my own strength. This thorn is tormenting me. And you see, that's what Paul is speaking about here. And I know that being a messenger of Satan can be confusing, but let me put it to you like this. Satan isn't the cause. So let me state that. Satan isn't the cause of the thorn. The Lord is the one who gave him the thorn. But Satan is the instrument. You need to understand that. So in a sense, Satan is helpless in this situation. God is sovereignly using him and ruling over him, and he will only be allowed to operate within the parameters that God has set. Much like in the life of Job. The Lord said, Satan came and said, Lord, yes, but if you do this, and the Lord said, okay, you can do this, but you can't do this. You see? So he limits him. And so it is the same here. So that's really the second question. Who gave the thorn? Well, it's the Lord. And he uses Satan. And Paul doesn't go into any detail about solving this conundrum of how can the thorn be a messenger of Satan and it's from God? Well, hopefully what I've said will help. Satan is the instrument. God can use any instrument. He can use anything. He can use a storm. He can use lightning. He can use a swarm of bees. Where do I get that from? I remember watching a rugby game and I was only too keen to see this game. I was frustrated. It had to start. It started 2 hours late. And the thorn was getting too much for me. And then we were told that day they had put pink flags around, where they've got the halfway line and the try line, and they had used pink flags, and it attracted a swarm of bees. And the two teams ran out onto the field, and the ref looked around and he blew the whistle and said, back inside. And we watched an empty field with swarming bees for 2 hours. And I only thank the Lord that the game did go ahead. You see, the Lord can do that. I think, and I remember that, if the Lord doesn't want that game to start, boy, he can send. And I know it sounds trivial, but he's in charge of the trivial things. Nothing's trivial to God. Nothing is trivial to God. Everything is under his control. And you see, it's just telling me I should be winding up, and I am. There's a lot of mystery about the thorn. What was it? Some people have said Paul had epilepsy. Some people said he had a stutter. Some say he had bad eyesight. None of these can be fully verified from Scripture. There's like hints, So Paul says you can see what large letters I've written to you. And they say, oh, Paul must have had bad eyesight, because he couldn't see. Well, okay, if that's what you'd like to take it as, that's fine. But the thing about the thorn is Paul's focus is not on the thorn, but on why God gave the thorn. Forget the thorn. It can be anything. Choose what you want. But the focus is on why. And so I found the translation. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me and to keep me from becoming conceited. Can you see how it started with becoming conceited and ended? That's the ESV. And you see, that's why Paul was given the thorn. And that's why God gives you thorns. And he gives me thorns. Now, he may give you more than one. He may have to give you 2 or 3 or 4. But he'll give you enough so that you don't become conceited. He'll give you enough in your life to hold you back. It could be in your health. It could be in your children. It could be in a neighbor. It could be something that greatly disappoints you that comes up and you think to yourself, oh Lord, I can't take any more bad news. And the Lord says, I'm sending you a thorn to keep you humble. You see? So that you don't become conceited. You see, we are prone to self-confidence. And we are prone to pride. We are prone to self-devotion, self-preservation. We basically are prone to self. And we should be prone to God. In all of these things, it's not what we do or say, it is who are we trying to glorify? Who is our greatest concern? And so to stop Paul from becoming, and the word that is used here is the word elated. To stop him from pushing himself up and beginning to think that he's superior because of all the visions he's had and the revelations, says the Lord gave him a thorn. Now I just want to close, and I want to remind you, and I just want to be careful when I say this because I don't want to take it too far. I want to remind you that Jesus wore a crown of thorns. He wore a literal crown of thorns. But symbolically behind those thorns, there was his pain and his agony. And you know, Jesus is an abject picture of weakness. If you look at him as someone who came to establish a kingdom, he's more than likely the weakest of all kings in a worldly sense. But you know, in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4, said he came in weakness, but he rules in power. You see, the way to power is through weakness. The way to power is through weakness. You know, I was taken to these verses in the book of James, where James says to the people he's writing to, what is your life? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You know, if you're going to benefit from the thorns, and I'm going to benefit from the thorns that God sends us, we've got to have a proper view of ourselves. And every single person in this church this morning, in this hall, is nothing but a mist. And I'm acutely aware of that, because I will disappear and vanish, and no one will remember the place. Like a flower, you take a flower out and you don't remember where it came from. You don't know the place where it grew. And then it dies, it's gone. That's what we are like. You know, Paul, writing to the church in Laodicea, he said this: you say, I am rich. You say, I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, that you are pitiful, that you are poor, that you are blind and you are naked. You see, that's what Paul's telling. He says, I won't boast in my big experience. I can only boast in that my life is like the morning mist. Who am I? Paul says, who am I to boast about myself? He finds it so difficult to even talk about it. He puts it in the third person, and he's almost offhanded by saying, I know another man who went up. And this man experienced, he doesn't even say, I went up and I experienced. He says, now I can tell you about another man that I know, a man in Christ who was taken up. But he can't even bring the word I onto his lips. He can't say, I went up and I experienced. Because he doesn't want people to think more highly of him than they ought.